with that said, going out to your questions, there was a lot of questions we didn't get to yesterday. This first one was sent to us from Robbie. He's, of course, fighting on the front lines, voluntarily subjecting himself to public universities, same thing that produces the kind of madness we just talked about, and how they're presenting the Old and New Testament. And today's
and I am a product of public universities, by the way.
So it's not it's not an automatic corruption count, but it is a source of nonsense. You have to bring your brain. He was told by his professor that, of course, Satan was just a concept that the Jews borrowed from Zoroastrianism, and that the idea of Satan, the actual accuser or adversary, isn't an actual entity, and that to associate him with the serpent of Genesis chapter 3 is just a Christian interpretation, quote unquote. So his two questions are essentially, is there any reference to the devil, literally the adversary, the accuser, as the serpent exclusively from the Old Testament, or is this just a Christian interpretation in conflict with Judaism? And the second question, like it was, is the concept of Satan in Judaism borrowed from Zoroastrianism? Now, I did a YouTube video. I was challenged as to whether Zoroastrianism was true by the same standards that Christianity was.
Right.
I can get into that. But when it comes to the devil being the serpent in the Old Testament, does Isaiah 14:29 exist?
That's pretty conclusive, isn't it?
But in a more direct answer, that's what we need to ask. Obviously, Revelation chapter 12 couldn't be more explicit. The devil of old, who is called the serpent, and Satan, the accuser. Where do we get the idea that Satan is a conscious entity? And let's just limit ourselves to the left side of the Bible. Is this something that the Hebrews before Jesus' time would have agreed with us on?
Absolutely, they would have. I don't think there would have been any question in their minds along that line. No less a rabbi, if you will, than Jesus himself referred to Satan as being a liar from the beginning, referring to the beginning when he comes on the scene in the book of Genesis as the serpent who was beguiling Adam and Eve within the garden. Passages like Isaiah chapter 14, referring to Satan, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you're cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you've said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit above the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the earth, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High, yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, the lowest depths of the pit. No biblical scholar worth his salt is not going to see the overplay, the reference back to Satan's initial deception in the garden, saying, you shall not die, but you shall be as God. So that same sales pitch is very strongly indicated in that particular passage.
And we need to note the context, because people will say, no, there is no broader scope here. Isaiah 14 addresses the kings of Babylon, Assyria, the Philistines, and others accordingly, and is only making this parallel theatrically. But when we ask the question, does the theatrical comparison have to apply to a non-literal entity or not, that's a misnomer, bordering on a red herring. Because when the king of Babylon is compared to Lucifer, literally son of the morning, that's what that's translated as in Latin, we are given the name of Satan before his fall. We are given a description of him that will parallel to another chapter we'll get into in a minute, where he is making boasts the king of Babylon was making. No, it was the same character flaw of the king of Babylon, pride. But did the king of Babylon ever boast against his fellow angels? Did he seek to exalt himself like the God of Israel that he didn't know existed yet until the time of Daniel?
Yeah.
The point is very clear. But if we're going to look for parallel accounts, sticking to the Old Testament, by the way, and I always remember this because Isaiah 14, double it and go to the right. Ezekiel 28
right.
also details the same principle.
Yeah, and again, there we see the power behind the king of Tyre. It says, thus says the Lord your God, you are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God.
Not the king of Tyre.
Okay. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and so on. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the days you were created till iniquity was found in you. To me, the smoking gun that the serpent in the garden is no less an individual than Satan by Old Testament definition is found here in Ezekiel chapter 28, where it says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Who was in Eden, the garden of God? This anointed cherub who covers, who had iniquity found within him, and then was cast down. I cast you out of a profane thing, out of the mountain of God. I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings that they might gaze upon you. You become a horror. You shall be no more forever. So for someone to say that the idea of a personal devil is a New Testament invention, first of all, Jesus seemed to indicate that the devil had been a liar and a murderer from the beginning. I think he's a pretty good source of reference as far as understanding Old Testament doctrines. And now we've not seen just not the account in Genesis chapter 3, but also in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel chapter 38, or 28, I should say, identifying Satan with that individual who came on the scene and tempted Adam and Eve in the garden. There is no lack of rabbinical commentary that verifies this particular take. So the overwhelming consensus, not just of the passages we see in the Bible, but as it was understood by the rabbis of its day, indicates that Satan was in view in both of these passages.
Even in fictional accounts like the Lesser Keys of Solomon and Kabbalic mysticism, they make a direct reference to Satan, or Samael as he's referred to, as the serpent in Eden. Of course, those accounts aren't literal, but you're noting how the people before Jesus' time were treating it in other than historical context, within prophetic and historical context, and this ongoing theme. And again, just you say, but it doesn't say serpent. Okay, Isaiah 14 and verse 29, in the same chapter where Satan is being used as a parallel between these corrupt kings, how do they mock the king of Philistia and saying your offspring will be like the serpent before you? That's the point.
Yeah.
So direct references, direct allusions, all the same forms and context. That professor, which is no surprise, didn't know what they were talking about.
And again, just to put the nail in the coffin, the oldest book of the Bible, chronologically, Job.
Which ironically brought this up.
Yeah, Job chapter 1 and verse 6 says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came in among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it. So we are introduced to this individual, not a metaphor, not a symbol, but an actual individual who is a sentient being, a choosing being, a moral being, a being that had access before God in heaven. He is introduced to us right off the get-go in the book of Job.
And others like the book of Zechariah after the Babylonian exile,
Right.
where we see a vision of him in chapter 3, accusing,
Yeah.
doing the same thing Revelation 12 describes him as doing before the throne of God, like Job describes him day and night as the accuser. So that's the point. This is a very Old Testament concept. The New Testament just cites it. And
Yeah.
again, to use the college term, scholarship and plagiarism, what's the difference? A footnote.
Right.
And if all of these New Testament references have the footnote of the Old Testament behind them, what's the problem here?
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, because you've done a video on this, got into a debate about it. The rap seems to be, and it does raise a larger issue as well, that the reason there's a Satan in the Bible is because the Jews borrowed a concept from Zoroastrianism. An entity, a figure in Zoroastrianism was the one that they co-opted into their books and had him explain, say, the presence of evil.
Yeah. Well, for all intents and purposes, just like the previous issue, the professor does not know what they're talking about. Zoroastrianism, for those of you who aren't aware, is a primarily Persian or Iranian today religion that was founded, ironically, around the same time that Daniel, Esther, and the people of Israel were brought from or into captivity in Babylon, and the Persian Empire, their alliance with the Medes, ultimately took over those territories. Now, to argue first and foremost, this is the first manipulation you need to be careful of. To say that the Jews had contact with the Persians, but had no solidified religious claims of their own. Tell me, it was Isaiah and Ezekiel, let alone Job, in writing for the Hebrews before the time of the exile.
Absolutely.
And note, unless you grant the documentary hypothesis, which is based on a verifiable lie, look at the Ebla tablets in Jordan, you have writing before the time of the Exodus. You have documentation, physical evidence, before the time of the Babylonian exile of the Hebrews not only existing in Canaan before the time of the exile, but even the ash lair where the Babylonians burned down what? Their place of worship to the true and living God when they took them into captivity. It all sets and matches the dates and times. You have to pretend this doesn't exist, which normally is frowned upon in academic circles. And if you think I'm being smarmy, I am. The idea of then Zoroastrianism being founded and based on something that would predate Judaism is actually also a lie. I don't say mistaken. We have verifiable evidence it's a lie. The reason why when you look at Wikipedia and other sources and say, oh, Zoroastrianism dates around 1,500 years before the time of Christ or BCE. Well, the problem with that is, how do they base that 1,500-year mark? Because they found temples in Iran, Persia, that include elements of what? The zodiac and fire worship, which is essentially the equivalent of saying, oh, Christianity's nothing new. There was this tribe over there in the Himalayas that believed in the concept of one God. See, they borrowed it from them. Okay, two people having a basic concept in the aspects of their worship does not mean that's Christianity or Zoroastrianism.
Yes.
So just because the zodiac, the stars in particular, are involved in worship in these ancient temples, ironically around the same time as the Exodus, does not mean the Zoroastrian religion existed 800 years before Zoroaster.
Correlation does not indicate causation, as they like to say.
Especially if the correlation is not true.
Yeah.
So Zoroaster, born around the time after Daniel had physically died, and they had access to the Hebrew scriptures throughout Persia, thanks to the efforts of Esther and Mordecai, we are noting a problem here. And this is what? They're playing fast and loose with some very important facts. First of all, the main spiritual text for the Zoroastrian religion is called the Avesta. They again have a Persian way of pronouncing it. I won't even attempt to. But the document in its writings discusses cosmology, its practices, and in particular, all of its ins and outs and hopes for the future. And there's three basic versions. I'll get back to that in a minute because it's going to become important. When they essentially lay out the concept of Satan being derived from Zoroastrianism, it's because Zoroastrianism, unlike Judaism, is a dualistic belief. It is a belief that there are two equal and opposite entities known as God, and that they're essentially the equal and opposite in power as well as virtue. Modern examples for kids would be things like Ruby, Star Wars, those kinds of things. You have an equally valid light and dark. They're both referenced as God. Now, Zoroastrianism, to its credit, describes the, unlike the Force, the conscious entity, the devil king, Ahriman, and the good king, or Mazd, or Mazda, ultimately what he is going to become.
I used to have a Mazda.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Different thing.
The idea is ultimately centered around this, though, that in one version of Zoroastrianism, in their cosmology and eschatology, their end times and their origins, they describe Ahura Mazda ultimately taking over Ahriman's kingdom and using his power over fire to consume the earth and lava. But ultimately, because the worshippers of fire will be protected from it, they will flourish in this new kingdom, and while Ahriman's followers and his influence over this world will be expunged. That's one version. And when they look at that compared to the Jewish version of the end times, not just in reference to Revelation, but Daniel 12 even. They see some parallels. But what do they leave out? Well, they leave out that the devil king, and I'm going to be very censored on this because like most pagan accounts, it gets really weird really quickly. The devil king, Ahriman, the devil god, the evil god, created the universe. Did the Hebrews borrow that? Obviously not. Is the God of Israel in a power struggle with the adversary, with the accuser, with the serpent? Obviously not. He was under his authority when visiting him in Job. He was overcome in the court by having the Lord rebuke him in Zechariah chapter 3. He was brought low as a cherub in Ezekiel 28. He was like the stars of heaven, not the most high. He thought he was, but he was mistaken. He was from a position of lowliness, trying to reach a higher position, not from a higher position and brought down to lowliness.
Right.
And this is where you're going to have to be prepared for the classic Bill Maher and zeitgeist rhetoric that always comes up when it comes to comparing to religions people don't know as much about. It's parallelomania, where you take little bits here and there, try to find the parallels, ignore the other obvious glaring differences, and say, because I can draw these lines, therefore it's a copy and paste argument. It's ultimately based on nonsense because you have to fundamentally misrepresent one or both religions in order to draw those parallels. Another example would be Egyptology. When they say, oh, Jesus and Horus are basically the same. Well, first of all, Jesus didn't have a bird head. Secondly, Isis, his mother, wasn't a virgin. Thirdly, Osiris was dead when they were conceived. That's left out. Fourthly, being ripped into 13 pieces and assembled apart from one in particular in order to accomplish that is kind of weird. Fifthly, I know the baptizer. Where are you getting that from? It's false. He had 12 disciples. No, he's associated with the zodiac. There it is again. On and on it goes. They have to either misrepresent or over-exaggerate very broad concepts to come to a very narrow conclusion. That's not how facts work. That's not how arguments work. And you need to be aware of that manipulation. So when I said 3, I mentioned 1. There's another that circulated among Zoroastrian circles that was generally assumed to be the earliest. It was the belief and idea that, like every other pagan religion, the control and the prominence of Ahriman and Ormazd is cyclical, and they generally associate it with a 4,000-year cycle, where in one session they're equal in power. In one session, Ahriman is in power or prominence over Ormazd and his followers. There's another session where they're equal in power, and another session where Ormazd is in power, and then it continues from there.
Very Star Wars-like.
Yeah, and of course, this is the one that's generally, I'm not saying it carte blanche, but generally the most respected today. And guess where it comes from? It came from India. Now, how did they get there? Obviously, it's closer to them than most countries would be. You just go two countries to the east. But when the Muslims in the 7th century AD, not BC when Zoroaster was born, AD, after the time of Christ, moved into Persia under the Umayyad caliphates and so forth, their conquest of this region had a direct, like from the Quran, basically persecution towards Zoroastrians or fire worshippers. In fact, one of their co-opt stories regarding Abraham being delivered from a fire, which was, by the way, based on a mistranslation from a rabbi. He thought the Hebrew word for fire, one of them anyway, was not the Babylonian word for fire, which is city, or Aramaic, The point was hilarious when you know that the Quran's author didn't know the difference between a misunderstood reference and tried to build a story off of it in order to debunk Zoroastrians and say that fire worshippers, like Nimrod, he wasn't a fire worshipper, were in the wrong. The point being made, though, is this. Muslims had a decided chapter and verse incentive to persecute Zoroastrians just like Jews and Christians. So what did they do? They fled. They went to the east. They tried to escape into northern India, where the Muslims ultimately tried to follow them. And the majority of their text, guess what? This is important. Copied from local Hindus and adopted their principles into their religion, where this cyclical system came into play. Now, that's verifiable. The earliest actual writings of the Avesta are dated to the 15 to 1600s in India. And a French archaeologist was the first one to actually copy and document it in the 17 to 1800s. It's escaping the back of my mind right now, but very recent history. So when we're talking about these very, very fanciful presentations of Jews copying from pagan Zoroastrians, the only thing you have going for you in that argument is one time they had a long-term interaction with each other, meaning their time in Babylonian exile when the Persians took over that region. But what don't you have? You don't have cause, means, motive, or any physical evidence that they would adopt pagan aspects into their religion, whereas you actually have means, motive, opportunity, and demonstrable physical evidence they copied from other pagan religions when it suited them. So what's more likely? The Zoroastrians copying from the Hebrews, like they already did with the Indians? Or the Hebrews copying from the Zoroastrians, which their entire culture was contrary to doing from its foundation? You have to exercise more faith than the evidence can actually support you. So here's the point. The Avesta, what we know about it, it's post-dating Judaism and Christianity by over 1,000 years. Our earliest copy of the Bible, the Codex Sinaiticus, that's 300 years after Christ. The earliest Avesta, it's about 1,400 years after that.
Yeah, and I think the real issue comes down to, and we hear it a lot in this day and age, is Christianity, Judaism just cut and paste borrowing from other religions. That was the essence of the theme of the Da Vinci Code, Tom Hanks, and so on.
Zeitgeist.
Putting forth all these things. The problem is that kind of borrowing, especially in light of how the Old Testament, for instance, portrays what happened to the Jews when they tried to borrow from other religions. Boy, read the book of Jeremiah, read the book of Ezekiel, read
the book of Deuteronomy.
The whole thing. It's like, read the book of Joshua about the idea of not allowing other religions to corrupt you and turn you away from God. Read Numbers chapter 25. The thesis sounds good when it's presented out there in the ether, but when we take a look at the primary documents, it simply does not hold sway. New Testament sense, when Jesus interacts with the woman at the well, who was a Samaritan, which was an example of Jewish people who borrowed from other pagan concepts, put it in a blender and turned it on puree. When the woman said, why do you Jews say Jerusalem is the place we should worship when we say Mount Gerizim is the place you should worship? And Jesus, first of all, gets down to the heart of the issue. He says, ma'am, the day is coming when neither in Jerusalem nor on your mountain will you worship, for God desires worshipers to worship him in spirit and truth. These are the worshipers he seeks. But regarding a relationship with God, the truth about God, Jesus said that, again, you worship that which you don't know. We worship that which we know, for salvation is of the Jews. So this idea that somehow Christianity or Judaism borrowed from other sources just doesn't stand up under examination with the primary documents.